All rise. We will wait. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour Pénale International est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Thank you very much. Court officer, please call the case.
Thank you, Mr. President. Situation in the Republic of Kenya in the case of the prosecutor versus William Samoei Ruto and Joshua Arap Sang, ICC 01090111. And we're in open session, Your Honors.
Thank you very much. Witness, welcome back with us. Appearances remain the same?
Same for the prosecution. Good morning, Your Honors.
Thank you.
Same for the victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Narsetsing.
On our part, Mr. President, we are joined by one Joel Bosek, Mr. President.
We're the same. Mr. Khan and Ms. Allegenda have rejoined us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garcia, please proceed. You said you have 15 minutes. You requested for 15 minutes?
Indeed, Your Honors. I have no more questions, substantive questions for the witness. And as I stated yesterday, the 15 minutes that I needed for this morning's sessions were simply to plead on the introduction into evidence of the expert report and 2 documents. So that's the only reason I needed the time this morning.
All right, that is the only reason. Okay. The introduction of the expert report and 2 documents. Why don't we take them one at a time? The report.
Indeed, Your Honor. So it would be introduction of the report, which is Ken OTP 00930871. Translation as well. And 2 documents, both the documents I think I mentioned yesterday, but it's the document courting the Kalenjin, the failure of dynasticism and the strength of the ODM wave in Kenya's Rift Valley province, and that's Ken OTP 00460014. And also a document by Jacqueline M. Klopp titled Ethnic Clashes and Winning Elections, the Case of Kenya's Electoral Despotism. So those are the documents that the prosecution wishes to tender.
Mr. Hooper?
Your Honour, may I respectfully suggest that defence submissions in respect of that come at the end of this witness's testimony. It doesn't really matter when the particular items, if they become exhibited, are exhibited. But the reason for that being that then the court sees the overall testimony and any references or not that the defence might make to the documents, which might be or may be not a relevant consideration. I'm merely suggesting that the consideration is deferred until the totality of the evidence in respect of Dr. Professor.
So that is not at this point an outright objection. No, you say we can take it up later. Mr. Kiginkato, what's your own position?
We take the same position as Mr. Hooper, Mr. President.
Mr. Garcia?
Your Honors, I leave it to the discretion of the Chamber. I'm fine either way.
Flexibility is a good thing when we can manage it. So the Chamber will, because this is an expert witness, we will take up the matter at the end of the cross-examinations then. All right. Mr. Hooper, then you may. Who goes first? Is that Mr. Hooper or Mr. Kigen-Katwa?
Yes, the coin fell to me, so I go first.
All right. Witness Mr. Hooper will be. 1 second. Mr. Naratete, you're about to rise.
Microphone, please.
It's not working. All right. Sorry. Good morning, Your Honor, Mr. President. You have obviously observed the absence of Mr. Indiretu. So we have consulted, and after having read carefully the report prepared by Mr. Mapu and also evidence provided in court, the legal representative decided not to ask any further questions. Any more questions in addition to those questions already asked by the prosecution. But at the same token, we would like to notify that the next witness who is dual status, for that witness, the Mr. Indiretu will come to court and will question the witness himself. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that indication, Mr. Naratete. So that settles the matter of the questioning of this witness by Victims' Counsel. Mr. Hooper, please proceed. Witness Mr. Hooper will now ask his own questions and cross-examination. Thank you.
Good morning, Professor or Dr. Mopo?
Doctor.
Dr. Mopo. Well, good morning. Now, first of all, it might be helpful if you have a copy of your report in front of you, if you don't have it at present, and perhaps in particular a copy in English, because my understanding is that you are totally at ease with reading English and working in English, and on the basis that our understanding is that the report has been accurately translated, it would be helpful and time-saving if we just refer to the one. Now, I on reflection overnight, I can say now I don't have a great many questions of you today, and I think that we can probably conclude certainly my questioning, I hope, by the second session of this morning. First of all, thank you very much for your evidence, and thank you for what was clearly an effort on your part to be as objective as possible. And also thank you for being very straightforward in describing your own spheres of expertise, where your strengths are and where they're not so strong, and in particular, of course, in respect of the Caligen. I was interested to hear yesterday a point that you spoke about towards the conclusion of your evidence, and that was in respect of Mungiki. And of course you are, I think we can all consider an expert in the Mungiki group, Kikiyu group. And your view yesterday that you expressed was quite clear, that at the end of 2007, having suffered all the depredations they did at the hands of the Kibaki government, or more particularly the police, 500 of them killed and the rest of it, that by the end of 2007 they were, in your view and opinion, a spent force, and therefore not really in a position, one would conclude, to conduct attacks of any size or the like. But their reputation, and I see you nodding, and that's sufficient. I put your nod on the transcript, as it were, if I can deal with it like that.
I think he nods because he realizes he should not cross wires on the phone, on the microphone.
Yes.
So maybe if you allowed him time, he might record his voice.
Yes,
It's
indeed.
of God for him to do that.
I'll give you the occasional opportunity to say something, obviously, Dr. Mopo. But I'm stepping over what was clearly stated yesterday. And I think you'd not disagree with my brief summary of your view.
Tout à fait.
Answer, yes, indeed.
But, you told us, of course, they had this satanic reputation. And that reputation lived on and invested the thoughts you accepted of perhaps particularly many Kalenjin youths looking onto this situation, and inspired fear and rumours among them that you clearly accept. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
Now, your question 9, or I say your question, the question 9 that was posed to you, and I'm looking here at the English translation, which starts at KEN-OTP 0093 1330. It's question 9. It's quite a long answer you give there, and I'm looking at the third page of it, which is in the English version, if you have that, is at 1333. And you've been asked, I'll let you get that, because I appreciate it's particularly sitting in a witness box, not easy rummaging around with papers. But if we look at 1330, question 9, you're asked who are the main factions in the post-election violence? What were the reasons why they divided along those lines? Please answer with reference to Kenya as a whole and a Rift Valley in particular, which sounds rather like an exam question to me. And you start off by making clear that you're not happy with the terminology, that the word faction is a loaded word and not neutral. And in that second paragraph of your answer, you state that there were 3 main types of actor. And instead of using the word militia groups, you use the phrase that's translated into English as violent youth groups. Violent youth groups. And for my part, I understand why you use that, and perhaps it's the preferred word, violent youth groups, because militia has perhaps an added connotation to it. Now, violent youth groups. Now, if we turn to page 1333 of that document, it's 3-4 pages on, and look at the start of the third paragraph, state officials, it starts, and we read in, you talk about state officials, and then you say, but the actors par excellence. Have you got that bit?
Where are you, Mr.?
I'm at page 1333, and I'm at line 10. But the actors par excellence. And I hope our interpreters also have copies of this document.
So we're looking at the big paragraph, that's the
Yes.
third paragraph down, the second line.
Yeah, it's the second complete paragraph of that page, and it starts state officials, and I'm looking at but the actors par excellence, because I'm looking at violent youth groups, stroke militias. So if we have that, I'm just going to read into the transcript what's said there, and then take it up from there. So if you can follow it, I'm just reading the it into our transcript, Dr. Mappo. The actors par excellence during this period were the militias, both those linked to the opposition and those which were government-aligned. But the academic literature on the 2008 crisis scarcely presents any original data on this type of actor. A significant case in point is that of G. Lynch. For the past decade, her papers on the field of Kalenjin politics have drawn admiration from all specialists. She naturally devoted several papers to the 2008 post-election crisis in Rift Valley, where she dissects the causes of the election results, the triggers of the violence, and the discourses of all the actors. But she completely omits to deal with the perpetrators of the violence. That is, she goes back over what the official reports were produced when the country was emerging from the crisis, and studies by human rights NGOs say. This silence on the part of the social sciences regarding the groups involved in the post-election violence is ironic, in that the researchers routinely studied the violent youth gangs. Now, just stopping there. And if we drop down to the penultimate paragraph, well, in fact, the beginning of the next paragraph, because you then go on to the Mungiki, and you go, having spoken briefly about the Mungiki, you go, researchers were no more forthcoming about the Kalenjin militias. Indeed, vigilante and militia groups who committed ruthless acts outside election periods were barely studied. As a result, they guessed at the characteristics of these youths by scrutinizing the course of the clashes. Now, just stopping there, in the course of it's the Hague, I'm afraid, it does that to us. First of all, having read the English of that, do you accept that's a fair translation of what you've said in the French?
Oui, oui, ça correspond.
Yes, that corresponds to what I wrote in French.
And indeed, you reflected that in your evidence, as I recall. And indeed, you spoke about the lack of even more recent material. And so the position that we're left in is essentially this, that in the world or the field of political science research, there's been no research into what the primary actor, the youth, violent youth, what he says or explains his motives to be. That's the difficulty, is it not?
Alors c'est, en effet, j'y ai...
In fact, I alluded on several occasions yesterday and before yesterday to the fact that we have a real problem because there is a lack of sources about these militias, how they functioned, how they were set up. We have sources such as NGOs, human rights organizations, particularly human NGOs. But these are things that have been rarely considered by the social sciences specialized in militia groups. But in spite of everything, even though we did not have specialists that specialized on these particular groups, we can look at other analyses on the functioning of similar groups, of such groups. And such analyses come from other branches of social sciences that seem to be far away from this domain, particularly the analysis of the land tenure system, the structures of the land system, and how it functions. These are the people who tell us the most interesting things that help us to interpret the situation, but they do not add any new information.
Thank you very much. Now, I notice you go on just very briefly to speak about the role of opinion leaders, and again a term that you expanded on yesterday. In your article here, in your report here, you speak of business communities. I'm looking at the opposite page, 1334, fourth paragraph, where you say throughout the country, business communities are key actors. And you also, just dropping your eye down a few lines, you refer to reports by human rights NGOs, as well as those by the ICG, that's the International Crisis Group, 2008, and the KNCHR report, 2008, which you say spoke of the role of former Kalenjin athletes. And you also talk of several studies have highlighted the influences of certain school teachers, for example. And you then say this: it should be noted that all the information we have on the role of opinion leaders during the 2008 post-election violence comes from official investigation reports linked to crisis recovery procedures, or from NGOs, full stop. And then you say this: the information is accurate and the data factual, but they are still incomplete. Now, just pausing there. On reflection, it would be fair to say that as a political scientist, you might rely on such things. But would you concede that, of course, we don't know if the information is accurate and the data factual, unless, of course, we know and have presented and have examined the sources of that information? It's the difference, perhaps, between the legal and the political scientist approach. Would you concede that?
Oui, à partir de ces...
Answer: yes, based on those primary sources from the NGOs, it is necessary to assess the quality of the information and try to cross-check with several NGOs in order to determine whether the information is consistent, so as to have information coming from various regions and try to see whether this information matches each other. So there's a great deal of work of assessment of sources which has to be done, and those NGO sources, of course, cannot be accepted on their own. So you have to put them in perspective, put them into context, and assess the quality.
And one difficulty, of course, is because of the relative lack of research, for example, amongst the armed violent groups, that NGOs, NGOs are really having to often eat, as I can put it this way, the same dish. In other words, it's a self-perpetuating difficulty, isn't it? Because once you get some item of bad information into the circuit, as it were, it can corrupt and alter views, which is why you've made this point, is it not, that you do need objective research, and that hasn't taken place. Not certainly to a standard that you would like.
Yes. What's lacking at the moment is data, primary sources, and analysis. With regards to the human rights NGOs, you have to explain the situation in Kenya. It's very particular with regards to other countries in Africa. There's an extraordinary wealth of this in this environment. You don't have one single type of human rights NGOs. You have a very great diversity of organisation of sources, with, in particular, human rights NGOs, for example, very traditional, classical types, inspired from Western structures, but at the same time, you have structures which come from churches as well. The churches, with regards to this violence, have given a lot of information because they're right at the heart of the process. They are the ones who receive the displaced people. They are at the heart of this process here. And from them, we have a massive amount of information. Sometimes they don't give it directly. It goes via other human rights NGOs. So there's a whole work to get to know that environment sufficiently in order to see who is providing the sources. Are they reliable? In particular, do those who have given the sources, do they really know the field? When there are people from the religious area who took in the refugees, they have information which is completely reliable. It would seem to me very often that that would give an indication. Now, if they go through another NGO, it's different. They might do so because of political reasons. Perhaps they don't want to pass on the information directly.
I'll give you an example, if I may. For example, just take one example. On page 1337, looking at the fourth line from the bottom, and you're talking about some communities form militias which attack their own neighbours. And then you go on to say this. Thus, several studies and help yourself to a glass of water. Don't feel constrained by being caught in that way. Not nice having a cough. Thus, several studies have highlighted the fact that initiation ceremonies for young people transitioning into adulthood were apparently used for training and indoctrinating these people. And you quote there the ICG report, 2008, and the OHCHR report of 2008. So there's a statement that's been made. We don't know, of course, looking at that, whether it's true or not. But the footnote in the OHCR report refers to this information, further information, that there were reports that the initiation ceremonies had been moved to October and November instead of December in order to train up their militia. Now let's just pause there. So that's the kind of information that's now being used to justify that statement. But that information you see, could be wholly wrong, as it is in that case, I suggest. That we've certainly heard no evidence here of ceremonies in October and November or a change like that. So do you see the point I'm making? But that once it starts moving that kind of information, it can start to emerge here and there, and it becomes accepted as a fact, whereas the original source perhaps may not have been examined as well as perhaps you'd like to have examined it if you were researching, perhaps looking for corroboration, looking for almost taking a legal view of it. Do you see the point I make? So from time to time, in these reports and in your report, you yourself pick up on information. You don't know the source, you don't know the truth and accuracy of it, but for political scientists making a report, it sufficiently appears sufficiently reliable to include in a report. There's the difficulty, isn't there? Do you see the difference between the political scientific method, perhaps, and the legal method?
Just on the form, the manner in which the question is put, the question has lasted about 2 or 3 minutes. It contains about 3 or 4 different propositions. Mr. Hooper has incorporated in some of those propositions his own view on the evidence. I think it's a bit complex, and I think if we want to further the debate and get to the determination of the truth in what the witness knows and doesn't know, the question should be a bit shorter and contain 1 proposition or 2 at most.
Not 2. 1 is best. The objection is sustained.
Yes. Sorry, it was a multi-faceted question there. But you get the point. And what would your comment be in terms of my concern?
Why don't you ask the question again? The objection is sustained, so that question needs to be
I just noticed that Dr. Mopo was nodding his head at me, and I was trying to take it shortly. The problem, Dr. Mopo, is that a statement of facts such as that could be leave aside whether it's right or wrong. It could be right, it could be wrong. We don't know unless we're in a position to examine the source. That's I suppose, self-evident, isn't it?
So, yes. Well, I understand your argument. You're referring to something which is very real. When you have a primary source, there's an infinite repetition. It's repeated over and over again, the same thing, even if we don't know if the primary source is information which is reliable. Yes, there is that phenomenon. That's very real. And it's undeniable. But there are also sources that appear, for example, post-crisis, there were a whole series of commissions which interviewed a lot of people, and therefore, through these interviews they carried out, they brought new information, new primary information and sources, not linked to what had been said previously in the reports, which had been made at the time, if you like, the hottest time in the crisis, when the ICC, Human Rights Watch, etc., when they came out. There are some reports, to the best of my knowledge, linked to these witness interviews, which refer to that, but they don't give precise information. Where you have names that are given, these are names with regards to places, or where allegedly these ceremonies took place, dates, they are in reports of the Human Rights Commission, Kenyan National...
You got me on it now. KNCHR.
CISA. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Which we've quite a lot about in this case. There's a very good example, is it not?
Right.
It's gone out and seen people and made a report based on what it's heard from those people. Is that right?
Right. Yes.
And that's in fact a principal source I see in your report, is it not?
C'est une source importante.
It's an important source, yes.
Thank you very much. Very well. Now, I move from methodology, if you like, and I just want to go through a little bit about the history, or particularly the political history, that you touched on yesterday, and thank you for your help in that. And I want to go back and start with the very early years, and much of my source material comes from Daniel Branch, who appears in your bibliography, Gabrielle Lynch, of course, Miss Wrong, whose well-known book, and you're nodding in recognition of all those names, are you not? Just for the transcript. In the early years, in 1963, Kenya became an independent sovereign state, and it became an independent sovereign state with a constitution. And here's my question. That constitution had been a constitution that had been agreed between the KANU and KADU elements, principally. Is that right?
C'est exact.
That's correct.
And that constitution was essentially a federal constitution.
Oui.
And when we talk about Majimbo, and we use the word Majimbo, all that Majimbo means is that it's a Swahili word meaning regional, or based on the word in Swahili for region. Is that right?
Oui.
So if I'm a Kenyan hearing Majimbo being used, I'm hearing the phrase, as it were, regionalism or region. Very well. Now, the first president of Kenya, as we know, was Jomo Kenyatta. And is it right to say that he set about, with those around him, at dismantling that agreed federal constitution?
Oui. Enfin, vous utilisez le terme de...
You use the terms of concerted, but it was a constitutional formula which was negotiated with the colonial power, which was imposed on KANU at the time. That's how they felt it, at least. So this federal form, this was not appreciated by KANU, and so they obtained a majority. When they obtained a majority, they got rid of this constitutional formula which had been imposed by the colonial power, and they put into place their own vision of the constitutional system as they understood it.
Mr. Hooper, please. You said it was an imposed arrangement imposed by the colonials as they were leaving, and it did not find favor with KANU. Could you also explain whether there were other citizens of Kenya, maybe a KADU, who also did not find the arrangement, federalism, a happy one? that was imposed. Can you account for how all Kenyans felt at the time of the imposition, quote unquote, of that formula of federalism? How did Kenyans in general feel about it at the time?
As if you can, perhaps.
Difficile de savoir quel était.
The issue is basically what is the vision that the population had of the constitutional system as they would have wished it to be.
In relation to federalism, the federalism of it at the time, which you said was imposed. Yes.
I'm wondering if I can just ask a few more questions, because in fact I was coming to that, but in a particular way.
Just do this. Witness, can you respond now, and then counsel will pick it up later, perhaps from including questions arising from your answer.
Alors, il faut expliquer.
So you have to explain that decolonialization was done in very particular circumstances in Kenya following a war, a very violent war, horrific war. So the negotiation of the constitutional formula is done under circumstances which are particular, under pressure. So the British tried to develop a formula which would satisfy their interests, the interests of certain groups in society. And it's true, it wasn't the vision that an elite had, a Kikuyu-Luyu elite had. They saw, or they hoped for, a formula which would make it possible to have a lot more power than the federal system. In a federal system, this would divide up the power, and that would make it possible for there to be a multitude of different areas of power. That's it. The elite, or a certain elite from Kanu, thought that you had to develop a formula with a state, an executive state, which really was a magnet of power and could develop its policies and politics, because the federal form wouldn't allow that. And it's true that the federal system was firstly to serve the small groups, first of all, so it wasn't the Kalenjin, it was people from the coast as well. It was pretty much all a whole series of communities. They feared being marginalized by what they were experiencing in the great wider community.
What I'm trying to understand is if you're able to... I'm sorry, I see you've been coughing. At this point, I need to indicate it on the record in view of some comments made about that, and I'm sorry about that. If you need more time, let us know. What I'm trying to understand is how, if you can help me at this stage understand it, how Kenyans in general, to the extent that you can assist, felt about the federalist aspect of the 1963 Constitution that Mr. Hooper introduced in his testimony, in his questions to you. How did the Kenyans in general feel about it? You've mentioned Kikuyus, you've mentioned Luos, you've mentioned elites. I also want to understand how Kalenjins and the general population, quite apart from the elite, felt about federalism in the Constitution of 1963.
On n'a pas de source précise.
We don't have precise sources with regards to the opinions of the people. You can estimate them with regards to the position taking of their elite who are meant to represent them. And through that, what can be said is that the Kalenjin were very firmly behind the idea of a federal organization, and the issue at stake was very clearly for them to try and get customary rights on their lands, and it was through the federal formula they hoped.
He also said people on the coast. How did they feel about it?
La côte aussi, ils étaient...
The coast too. They were in favour of a federal solution.
Thank you. Mr. Hooper, please.
Perhaps I can tempt you to a Strepfin for coughs and colds, which may help.
Oui, non, mais vous inquiétez pas.
No, don't worry.
They're probably probably wouldn't go down with the French taste, I dare say.
All right, Mr. Hooper has graciously said we can see it.
But if you change your mind, do let us know. We have quite a supply on this side. So, but coming back right to the Constitution, the Mau Mau War had led to terrible depredations being inflicted on the Kikuyu people. Is that right? And estimates of Kikuyu killed. You nodded. Can we just have a yes or no for the answer was yes. Can you just say yes or no? Yeah.
Oui, il y a une estimation de...
As an estimation goes around the figure of 10,000 people who were killed.
Though I've seen estimates as high as 50,000, but whatever, there's still a large number of people. As you described in your evidence yesterday or the day before, it was a war of liberation, but had an ambiguity about it in as much as it was also a civil war amongst the Kikuyu. Is that right?
Tout à fait.
Indeed, the figures I've seen are that only about 60 whites were killed in the Mau Mau uprising. Give you some idea, gives us some idea of the imbalance there. But with independence, it would be right to say that the Kikuyus felt a degree of entitlement to, as it were, having the larger share of the cake. Would that be a rough but fair reflection of their position?
C'est dit un peu directement.
Well, there was a certain legitimacy. They considered that they had a certain degree of legitimacy due to their fight against colonialism. But at the same time, the fact that they were so numerous, their demographic force, the fact that the way they were in the economic system, their position, there were multiple factors that meant that the Kikuyu were at the heart of the process in the negotiations for independence.
Indeed, by the time of liberation and independence, it was probably the Kikuyus, despite that war, who had perhaps benefited the most from education and other facilities under the previous colonial government. Would that be right?
Yes, and particularly the fact that they were close to the capital. That's true.
Ils avaient également beaucoup souffert.
Also suffered a lot from colonialism. The fact that there were lots of different lands that were taken from them. So they adapted to the new structure, the new contingency, more quickly than other communities.
Now, KANU, the Kenya African National Union, had developed over the 10 or 20 years prior to independence. I don't want to go into that or their history. Became primarily a Kikuyu organization. Is that right?
Il y avait des élites.
Well, there was an elite that came from different ethnic groups, but it's true that there was a Kikuyu preponderance.
Tout dépend des races.
Everything depends on the roots that you have in Kanu. Well, yes, it could be said that there was a strong hegemony of Kikuyu.
And going ahead over the next 50 years, until 2002, Kanu became the primary political vehicle in Kenya, and indeed became the one party at the time when Kenya developed a one-party state constitution. Is that right?
Oui, alors
Yes. Well, you have to make a distinction between different periods. Kenyatta, the first president, he distrusted the partisan structures, party structures. He tried to avoid using these parties, and he managed the country from provincial administration, and the parties were hardly institutionalized. It was almost an empty structure. And it was basically Moi who restructured the parties and used them as a political machine from the 80s onwards.
Now, going back to this newly formed Kenya with its federal constitution and KADU, the Kenyan Africa Democratic Union, David Anderson in his book describes the formation of KADU as born out of fear. That is, born out of fear of a Kikuyu Luo dominance. Is that right?
Oui.
And in the negotiations, the constitutional negotiations, they and the KADU grouping, a very diverse grouping of people other than Kikuyus and Luos, wanted and struggled to have a federal constitution that they perceived would protect their individual interests and protect them from essentially a Kikuyu Luo power. Would that be right?
Le voir comme ça.
See it like that.
And one of the first things that Kenyatta did, once Kenya was independent.
1 second. My French not very good, but I do understand a bit of it. When the witness said "on voit comme ça," does it mean you can say it like that, or we can see it like that?
One can see it like that.
All right, thank you.
Le dire comme ça, c'est...
I would put it like that. It's acceptable. Yes, it's a way of summarizing things, yes.
Il faut voir la suite.
To see what's coming afterwards, put it like that.
All right. It's a very southern French attitude, if I may say so. Now, one of the first things that Kenyatta did in the newly formed Republic of Kenya was to work at dismantling that agreed constitution and replacing it with another constitution. Is that right?
Oui.
And he achieved that in 1969 when he replaced it with, instead of a federal, a unitary system. I'll go through the list briefly. Is that right?
Oui, ça s'est même fait.
Yes, that was even done before. To my knowledge, it was in 64 that people went to a unitary state.
He moved from a bicameral legislature to a unitary one. Is that right?
Oui, ah oui.
Yes, yes.
Oui.
He moved from
Oui,
a parliamentary
oui.
to a presidential system. Is that right?
Oui.
I say yes.
And he also reduced the rights contained in the Bill of Rights.
Oui.
Yes.
Under Kenyatta, he took considerable presidential powers, operating, as you've just said, really without a political party structure, and centralizing power very much in the hands of a Kikuyu elite. Do you agree?
Je ne peux pas dire que c'était au même.
I cannot say power was in the hands of the Kikuyu elite. There was a Kikuyuization of the administration, but at the senior level of the administration, there were many people from other ethnic groups. There was a certain degree of Kikuyu domination, but this took account of a sort of distribution of departments. That was more or less how the system worked.
But is it right to say that, for example, the key ministers were Kikuyu?
Par des ministères clés.
Most of the key ministry during certain periods were occupied by Kikuyu.
Almost half the permanent secretaries in the civil service were Kikuyu.
Ça dépend des périodes, mais oui.
Answer, it depends on the periods, but I can say yes.
Daniel Branch produces a figure of half of the top salaried civil servants, 222, half of them were Kikuyu. Do you accept that figure?
Oui, mais il vous dit.
Yes, but you can also ask what the date, the period was. There was a period when that phenomenon was very strong. It is true that towards the end of the Kenyatta reign, the Kikuyus have had a stronghold on the regime.
Oh yes, indeed. That it was a progression of taking power by an elite. The army, for example, had always been Kamba-run. That became Kikuyu-run. The GSU was established, became Kikuyu-run. That's right, isn't it?
Oui.
Yes.
You've talked about land distribution and significant migration from Central Province, out of Central Province, into areas that had previously been seen as traditional land of the Maasai or various Kalenjin groups. We spoke about that yesterday, and indeed by 1970, I think it's again Daniel Branch who describes it as becoming a flood. And indeed, your figures yesterday supported that view. Is that right? This was massive massive emigration out of largely central province into these other areas.
Je tiens à rappeler que
I should like to point out that the figures I gave yesterday, for example, the 500,000 people who migrated to the Rift Valley province. If Faulkner in 1970 estimated the number of people who migrated from 62 to 70. This is 500,000 people. But it was not only Kikuyu. We do not have precise figures here that gives us the distribution between the Luos, Luyas, and Kikuyus. We know that there was a dominance of Kikuyus in the distribution of land within the settlement schemes and land buying companies, but we do not have any precise figures.
Indeed, and as far as land buying companies are concerned, basically, for example, there would be perhaps a Kikuyu society that would just explain what we mean by that so that we better understand.
oui, les land buying companies.
The land buying companies were more Kikuyu because in order to set them up, you needed to have contacts at the summit of the state so as to use certain bank services and so on. For political reason, the fact is that many of the land buying companies were quite frequently Kikuyu in the 70s.
And indeed, again, Daniel Branch figure, he provides a figure in terms of loans, industrial loans, of all industrial loans in 1964 to 66. 64% of those industrial loans were to Kikuyus, and 44% of commercial loans were to Kikuyus. So in order to buy land, you need the money. But the tax, as it were what they were. So, obviously, this history, as you...
Mr. Rupert, he needs to react to the evidence, as it were, you've given.
Yes.
From somebody else.
Yes. The 64%, 44% figures of loans you seem to be agreeing.
Non, oui, je suis d'accord.
Answer, yes, I agree with your sources. It is obvious that the sources brought together by Daniel Branch are quite judicious and reliable.
And as against all the other provinces or areas of Kenya, Central Province, perhaps because, of course, Nairobi is there as well, but Central Province had superior education and health facilities, strikingly superior indeed to many areas of Kenya. Is that right?
Oui. Yes.
And so, as you were in fact saying yesterday, all this really conspired to bring about a high level of resentment, really, amongst groups who weren't benefiting, and who were who weren't benefiting. That'd be right, wouldn't it?
Le penser, mais ça ne s'est pas.
Well, one can think so, but that was not expressed at that time through demonstrations and other means. One can deduce that, but it was not expressed through political actions or very clear political discourses. Is it because maybe the power, the authorities dominated the opposition, well, one can say that some of the opposition and even some Kikuyus were confined to certain areas by a regime that was an authoritarian one.
So we move on from independence in 1963 through the Kenyatta years and this assuming of greater and greater power by a particular group. And eventually, after a degree of illness, Kenyatta dies in August of 1978. Is that right?
Yes.
And perhaps to everyone's surprise, it's Daniel Moi who becomes the new president, succeeding him. Is that right?
Oui, c'était constitution.
Yes, it was provided for in the Constitution. He was the vice president, so quite logically he took over power. Is conventional constitutional rules that were followed.
There is some evidence that there, at that time, was a plan to take over power by force, the Sabayot land army and the like. There was certainly a Kikuyu interest, was there not,
Alors, apparemment, vous faites allusion, en effet.
Apparently, you are alluding to the fact that there was a faction close to the regime that would have wanted to prevent the passing over of power to Daniel Arap Moi. So there was a series of people close to the Kiambu elite who made a failed attempt to prevent the presidency being passed on to Daniel Arap Moi.
Well, Moi takes over power and by degrees he takes over more and more power, essentially, and eventually until he retires just prior to the 2002 election. Is that right?
Oui.
Answer yes.
And for many people, his regime had the hallmarks of corruption and the imposition of fear in Kenya.
Oui.
So yes.
On peut dire cela, oui, tout particulièrement.
Yes, in fact, particularly in the 80s, Daniel Arap Moi had put in place a strong authoritarian regime, a police state, which persecuted the opposition, which was really diminished. Yes, indeed, he reigned through fear.
As you were saying yesterday, his authoritarianism extended, in fact, to the Kalenjin people as well. And you nod and that's a yes, as we heard yesterday.
Bien sûr, c'est vital.
Yes, of course, it was crucial for him to ensure that the elite of his community should follow him, that there should be no dissidents.
And when we talk of his community, we might in fact be mistaken to use the identifier of Kalenjin to describe them, identifier being your language, I think political science language, as Kalenjin is an identifier, but as you pointed out in your evidence, it includes subgroups within it who are actually mutually antagonistic and they don't necessarily all get on. That's right, isn't it?
Oui, c'est une identité.
Yes, the Kalenjin is a recent identity that brings together a diverse group of people. It functions a little bit like Russian dolls, because in each identity you have other sub-identities. So at any one point, a political elite would mobilize some of those identities. In Mount Elgon, you had a conflict between two subgroups. So you have overlapping identities, imbricated identities, and the Kalenjin is made up of all these multiple identities.
I think we may have had the subgrouping divided earlier, but maybe not. So let me just, again, for the sake of the transcript and our case, just go through with you.
What do they have in common, Mr. Hooper, that would make it possible for all these subgroups to come together? Maybe you can explore that.
I will. Can I just nominate the subgroups? And I'll just read them out, and you can tell me if that's correct at the end. The Nandi, the Kipsigi, the Tugan, the Kayo.
Together, maybe you can explore that.
I will. Can I just nominate the subgroups? And I'll just read them out, and you can tell me if that's correct. The Sebayot, the Pokot. You can tell me if break if they need it. So there's 8 groups there. Now, most of them are pastoralists. That's something they have in common, but not all of them. Is that right?
Je dirais plutôt agro-pastoraliste.
I would say agro-pastoralists.
Right.
C'est-à-dire, oui.
And they made their way into the area that they inhabited 600 or 700 years ago as separate tribal groups. Each of those groups is broken into clans. They have a similar but not the same language between them, but it has strong similarities. Some groups find it harder to understand others. And what brought them together was I suppose, that background. Is that right? And particularly under Moy, as a young man, seeking a political platform, perhaps, a grouping of people that were given the name Kalenjin. Kalenjin, in fact, stands for
Mr. Hooper, one at a time. There are so many propositions there. Witness, you can now. Can you let him?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you begin? Mr. Hooper has indicated certain characteristics which he'd say might have brought the groups together. Can you react? Do you agree with him on all that, or do you have disagreements or comments?
Oui, je suis d'accord avec.
Yes, I agree with you to the extent that this was a federation of groups that came together with a political objective, the political objective of becoming a force that would be influential. They understood that separately they wouldn't have any great capacity, any great influence, and in fact, there were certain political leaders, including Daniel Moy, but he was not the only one. They understood that there would be a possibility to bring these communities together. It is true that they had a common interest, that is to reacquire their land rights, and this was the original source of their understanding, which later on was frittered away.
But quite apart from the political consideration that may have brought them together, What about the ethno-cultural elements that Mr. Hooper indicated? Similarity in language, way of life and all that. Can you comment whether there was enough of that to explain that confederation of different ethnic or sub-ethnic groups?
Alors oui, c'est des communautés.
Yes, these are communities that shared common land ownership. They were both in competition and cooperation. Depending on the periods, people moved from one identity to another. So they had common practices, particularly relating to land use, so it was easy to work together. But progressively, there was an evolution of the way of living of the various communities, which created differences between the various subgroups. So progressively, their ways of life became slightly different, which undermined that common identity and undermined as well all the hard work that had been done to make them understand that it was in their interest to work together.
There were also a powerful warrior people, particularly, I understand, the Nandi and the Kipsigi, particularly the Nandi. We hear about the Maasai a lot, but in fact the warrior group par excellence in that area was in fact the Nandi traditionally. Is that right?
Les Nandis qui se sont le plus illustrés.
The Nandis became very well known at the time the territory was conquered by the British. They were the most virulent, the most active in trying to prevent the British from acquiring those areas. So they have been known to be great warriors in the past, and this was revived. This notion was revived from the years 1990 to 2000.
But are the Maasais, do they come in within this larger umbrella group, Kalenjin, or are they out of it?
No, they're out of it. And you agree with that. And indeed, for example, Muller, was it Klopp? Muller, I mean, she studied, you gave that example yesterday, she studies the Maasai in around Lake Naivasha, that area there. So the Maasai the Maasai basically inhabited that part of Kenya that we see between Central Province and the highlands above Nakuru. Would that be right?
Oui, les différents clans.
Yes, the various Maasai clans occupied that entire area. This was their natural area of influence. It is, of course, an identity that is totally different from the Kalenjins, but politically, Daniel Arap Moi understood that there were common interests to be developed. So he tried to develop that identity of Kamatusa, Kalenjin, Maasai, and Samburu, and another group.
I'll come back to this particular area. Of course, the Kalenjins area, the Nandi and Kipsigis area in particular, very much came into focus when the British colonists built their railway from Mombasa up into Uganda. And it passes through Nandi and Kipsigi territory. And that's when there were 4 or 5 years of war, I think,
Oui, c'est ça, c'est ça.
That is correct.
And in fact, the Nandi put up the greatest opposition to colonialism of any group, I think, within Kenya, more so than any other group, in terms of how long they fought and resisted the colonialists.
En effet, au pouvoir colonial.
That is to the colonial power during the conquest at the beginning of the 20th century. In any case, the population could not have any strong opposition because these people were coming out of a terrible period of famine and epidemics. So all the communities of those regions were very weakened. So the British arrived in this territory, which had been ravaged by natural catastrophes. This meant that resistance to the conquest was relatively weak. But it is true that the Nandis succeeded in putting up a great deal of opposition.
And I'll come back to the Moi years, but after Moi, amongst many of the Kalenjin people, there was a sense of great shame at what Moi had done. Is that right?
Ce que semble dire.
That is what Gabriel Lynch appears to state.
They were appalled at, as it were, the reputation that he'd sort of given them. And as a reaction to that, as Gabriel Lynch points out, there was an effort on the part of the Kalenjins to invest in cultural entrepreneurship, as you would put it, through developing a greater sense of community amongst the Kalenjin, as you told us, in fact, yesterday. Is that right?
Oui.
And say yes.
Just as we come up to the break and a bit of relief for you, I'll just go through some of the things that she and others have identified. There were student associations, there was the Kalenjin language classes, reaching out to expats, diaspora group, website, the EMO Foundation, and you agree that these are all features that you've read about or are familiar with. Is that right?
Oui.
Say yes.
These are all occurring during the years 2000, leading up to 2007, this emphasis on a sense of a community. And I see the time.
Witness, before we rise, there was a question that Mr. Hooper had asked you, and the question was that Kalenjins he put the proposition that Kalenjins were rather embarrassed about Mr. Moi's regime and what he'd done. And you said that's what Gabriel Lynch says. What about your own views on the matter? Do you share Gabriel Lynch's views on it? Or would you rather defer it to Gabriel Lynch, whom Mr. Hooper had cited?
Gabriel Lynch.
In fact, Gabriel Lynch sort of qualifies that assertion by explaining that in the 90s, there was already preparation for the after Moi era. So you had a lot of elites from the various Kalenjin groups preparing that succession and trying to envisage their own situation after Moi would have left. So there was a sort of cultural renaissance, but there was a lot of work also at the social and economic levels. You had all these elites trying to work together based on what she describes to us. So there was a lot of dynamism within the civil society, particularly in the two most popular subgroups, the Nandis and Kipsigis.
We'll leave it there for now and take our morning break.
Thank you, Doctor.
And we will come back at 11:30. Court will rise.
All rise. We will wait.